What if you haven't truly started living yet? It might not be a comfortable question, but it's a necessary one. Because between routines, obligations, titles, schedules, empty promises, and the constant fear of making mistakes, it's easy to confuse the simple act of breathing with the deeper act of existing. How many times have you stopped to wonder whether the life you're living is really yours, or if, instead, you're just playing out a script written by others? Well-meaning parents, a society obsessed with success, institutions that reward obedience, dogmas that discourage questioning, and a system that punishes inner silence. In the middle of all that, where are you? Friedrich Nietzsche had a disturbing answer. Most people aren't truly living, they're merely surviving within a herd. According to him, real life doesn't begin when we're born, or when we achieve financial independence, or even when we feel safe or happy. True life begins only when we have the courage to look the void in the eye and declare, "From this day forward, I choose who I am." And that declaration doesn't come with comfort or guarantees, but after an internal revolution. Because to truly live, you must first die a symbolic death. A death to expectations, to imposed beliefs, to the fear of not fitting in. You have to be brave enough to smash the mirror that reflects how others want to see you and build a new one with your own hands. And yes, that hurts. Because there is no awakening without loss, and no freedom without vertigo. Nietzsche knew this, which is why he spoke of the Übermensch, not as some unreachable ideal, but as the natural result of someone who has walked through the desert of the soul and refused to give up. But what does it mean to cross that desert? It means you stop living reactively. Most of our days are filled with automatic responses. We dress according to trends, work to pay for things we don't need, say what's expected of us, and suppress what we feel just to keep the peace. Everything becomes mechanical, functional, aesthetically acceptable. But underneath that polished surface, a discomfort burns, one that no number of achievements or likes can silence. It's the discomfort of not being where we want to be, of not knowing who we are, of realizing we never truly chose any of this. Nietzsche called this mechanical life a form of slavery, not physical, but spiritual. A domesticated, comfortable, numbed existence where safe mediocrity is rewarded over real risk. He called it herd morality. The one that obeys without asking why, that accepts without understanding, that prefers peace over freedom. But then, what breaks that inertia? How do we make the leap? The leap happens when suffering can no longer be denied. Not the trivial kind, but the deep suffering that confronts us with the absurd. A betrayal, a loss, a devastating failure, a depression with no clear cause, moments when the mask no longer fits. And there, right there, when everything seems to collapse, something new can be born. If instead of running away, we dare to look. Nietzsche doesn't romanticize pain, but he sees it as a catalyst. Because only someone who has descended can hope to rise. Only someone who stood in the abyss can speak truthfully about the summit. And it's precisely in that moment, when we stop trying to fit in and begin asking why we're even alive, that the possibility of a real life emerges. Not a perfect life, but one that's truly ours. Not one free of mistakes, but one free of masks. Unlike motivational speeches that promise us a fulfilling life if we just follow certain steps, Nietzsche doesn't offer easy comfort. What he proposes is far more radical, to create meaning where there was once only chaos. And that means accepting there are no universal answers, that no one is coming to save us, that life owes us nothing. But it also means that, for the first time, we are free to write our own destiny. What would happen if you stopped seeking approval? If you dared to fail without apologizing? If you spoke out loud what you truly think, even if it made others uncomfortable? What if you chose a path simply because your soul asked for it, even if the whole world called it madness? That, according to Nietzsche, is where real life begins. At the exact moment we stop being reflections of the external world and become an inner fire. And it's not about living with arrogance, but with depth. Because an authentic life isn't always visible or celebrated. It can be quiet, lonely, even misunderstood. But it has something the correct life will never have: meaning. A meaning that can't be bought or inherited, but one that is conquered with every decision born from the soul, not from fear. Maybe that's why Nietzsche admired free spirits so much. Those who dared to be uncomfortable, dangerous, even absurd. Not because they wanted to provoke, but because they could no longer pretend. They had awakened. And once you wake up, there's no going back. What once felt like enough no longer is. What once made you happy now feels hollow. Because you've tasted something real, something non-negotiable, something chosen with blood and fire. Perhaps that's why his message still feels so relevant. Because although the world has changed in its appearance, its mechanisms of control remain the same. We're still pushed to fit in, to produce, to stay quiet, to obey. And we keep postponing the most essential thing of all, the encounter with ourselves. So the question still stands, what if you haven't truly started living yet? Maybe it's not about doing more, or having more, or appearing to be more. Maybe it's simply about stopping, listening to yourself in silence, asking with brutal honesty, this person I've become, did I choose it? And if the answer is no, then what lies before you is the most radical opportunity of your life, to begin again. Not from scratch, but from truth. Your truth. And yes, it will hurt, because giving birth to yourself is always painful. But what is born from that pain won't resemble anything you've lived before. It's fire, it's freedom, it's life in its purest form. And that, right there, is where it all begins. Most people fear freedom more than they fear slavery. Of course, they won't say it out loud because the word freedom is wrapped in promises, in epic speeches, in heroic slogans. But in practice, freedom means taking full responsibility for our choices, for our failures, for our contradictions. And that's heavy. That's why so many prefer obedience over decision. We'd rather follow rules we don't understand than sit down and ask whether they're fair, whether they represent us, whether they deserve our loyalty. We live trapped in the comfort of the known, even when the known is suffocating us. Nietzsche saw this contradiction with striking clarity. He didn't despise the masses out of cruelty, but out of brutal compassion, because he knew that every soul living under the shadow of the herd is asleep, and that sleep, though it may seem peaceful, is a slow kind of death. There's something deeply tragic about spending an entire life meeting expectations, checking boxes, chasing goals that don't even matter to us. Something tragic about living as if we were eternal, postponing the act of waking up for a tomorrow that isn't guaranteed. So where does the break begin? How does that inner shift, the one that changes everything, happen? It usually starts in silence. A mild discomfort that slowly becomes unbearable. A sense of misalignment. You don't fit in, no matter how hard you try. You do what you're supposed to do, but something inside you rebels. You begin to wonder if what they call success might actually be a disguised form of surrender. You start to doubt the paved roads, the inherited certainties, the formulas for well-being. And there, in the midst of doubt and pain, the tremor begins. It's not comfortable. It's not glamorous. No one applauds when you decide to take off the mask. On the contrary, the world around you begins to resist. Because when someone dares to be authentic without asking for permission, they unmask the falsehood in others. And that stings. Authenticity is dangerous because it's contagious. Nietzsche knew this. Whoever chooses their own life without following orders shakes the foundations of a society built on conformity. But there is a fierce beauty in that chaos. A raw joy, hard to explain, that appears when you no longer have to pretend. When you can say no without guilt, yes, without needing to justify yourself. When you discover that you don't need to be understood in order to feel at peace, because you've found an inner place that doesn't depend on anyone else. That place can't be bought or inherited. It's built with courage, with silence, with painful ruptures. The philosopher spoke of the revaluation of all values, a way of dismantling everything we once took for granted, so we can rebuild from our own depths. It's not just an intellectual task, it's a vital act. It's looking in the mirror and not recognizing what you see, and still deciding to move forward. To begin being who you are, even if you don't fully know what that means yet. Because at least you've stopped being what others wanted you to be. And that's already freedom. In that process, suffering becomes an ally. Not as something to be sought out, but as something that can redeem us. Because pain, when consciously experienced, doesn't destroy, it transforms. It strips away the unnecessary. It forces us to face what's essential. Loss can teach you what's true. Failure can free you from a borrowed life. Emptiness can push you to fill your soul with the only thing that matters, your truth. Pain, when not avoided or disguised, has the power to make us more real. But there's an obstacle even deeper than suffering, fear. Fear of rejection, of judgment, of being alone. Fear of messing up, of not being good enough, of not knowing what to do. Choosing your own life means walking without a map, without promises, without guarantees. There are no instructions. Just an inner compass you're only beginning to recognize. And sometimes not even that. That's why so many people never try. Because it's easier to live a comfortable lie than to face a truth that demands we change everything. However, something inside us insists. A barely audible voice, buried beneath layers of conditioning, whispers that there is more. That we are not here merely to perform functions, pay bills, and follow rules. That within us burns a spark that wants to ignite, a force that refuses to settle. That voice is fragile at first, but if we give it space, it grows. It becomes a cry. It becomes a force. It becomes a path. And then, even if everything outside looks the same, something shifts within. We begin to make different choices. We surround ourselves with people who nourish us instead of judging us. We move away from what drains us, from what numbs us, from what stifles our growth. We stop justifying our existence through sacrifice or perfectionism. Slowly, we learn to honor silence, slowness, not knowing. We learn to trust in that force that doesn't need to be explained, only lived. To truly live doesn't mean having all the answers. It means daring to ask the right questions, and staying with them without running away. What makes me feel alive? What parts of myself have I hidden to be accepted? What am I saying yes to when I really want to say no? What kind of life do I deserve, beyond what others deem appropriate? There are no formulas, only encounters. Encounters with ourselves, with pain, with beauty, with uncertainty. And on that path, at times unclear, the essential is revealed. Freedom is not a destination, it's a daily practice. A way of being in the world without surrendering to it. A way of loving without possessing, of creating without seeking approval, of living without asking for permission. Nietzsche didn't write to please. He wrote to awaken. And if his words still unsettle, it's because they still work. They keep reminding us that authentic life isn't handed to us polished, it's given raw. And it's up to us to carve it, with blood and with fire, until it becomes something worthy of being lived. And maybe that's the greatest act of courage we're asked for, to live a life without a script, but with meaning. A meaning that's not imposed from outside, but built day by day, with every honest gesture, every soul-born choice, every renunciation that brings us closer to what is real. Maybe there, and only there, begins what Nietzsche called real life. And then, when the mask falls, when the echo of other people's voices fades and silence finally reigns within us, we understand a truth that had always been there, waiting to be rediscovered. That life isn't about piling up achievements, or being accepted, or even being right. It's about being. And being, in its deepest sense, is nothing more than living in alignment with whatever burns within us, even if we don't always know how to name it. There is a moment, not always spectacular, or clear, or final, when one realizes that they've started to truly live. Not because they've found success, or perfect love, or the security they were looking for, but because they've stopped betraying themselves. Because they've chosen to lose rather than pretend. Because they've decided they will no longer mortgage their soul for a bit of approval. Because they've begun to say yes to what sets them on fire inside, and no to everything that wilts them, even if it hurts, even if it costs. And that moment, which may seem tiny from the outside, changes everything. Because we're no longer reacting to what happens to us, we're responding from who we are. We're no longer trying to be saved by others, or waiting for external signs to validate our path. We've learned to listen to ourselves with respect, to look inward with compassion, without shame. We've come to understand that perfection is a cruel invention, and that the deepest beauty lies in the cracks, in the wounds that have taught us to see with different eyes. Nietzsche didn't propose an easy life. Nothing about him invited comfort. His gaze was a constant invitation to vertigo, to throw ourselves into the abyss of our own authenticity, to destroy the fictions with which we had decorated our cage. But in that vertigo, in that fall, there was also a promise, the promise of being born again. Not in a religious or symbolic sense, but in an existential one. To be born not as a dependent creature, but as a free, conscious individual, owner of their strength and also of their shadow. That freedom is not absolute. There will always be conditions, contexts, stories that shape us. But within that complexity, there remains an irreducible, non-transferable space where our will resides. That place where, even if everything collapses, we can still choose how to respond. We can choose not to run, not to betray ourselves, not to silence what needs to be spoken, not to ignore what begs to be lived. Many will go through their entire lives without ever touching that place. Not because they don't have it, but because they were too afraid to open the door. Because they preferred noise over truth. Because they mistook stability for fulfillment. Because they were taught that living meant adapting, not blooming. But some, perhaps very few, dare to try. And even if they don't have all the answers, even if they stumble 1,000 times, even if they're misunderstood, they shine with a light that can't be faked. Because it doesn't come from image, it comes from truth. That light isn't always visible. Sometimes it hides behind a life that seems simple, a routine without grand gestures. But in every small act, in every honest word, in every choice that honors authenticity, there is a revolution. Because living from your true self in a world that teaches you to be someone else is, in itself, a profoundly subversive act. A form of quiet resistance. A yes to life that doesn't need to shout, only to be present. And it is in that presence that everything finds meaning. Not the kind of presence that imposes itself, but the one that observes, that listens, that inhabits each moment without demanding it to be different. Nietzsche spoke of the eternal return, that provocative idea of living as if each moment were to repeat itself endlessly. Not as punishment, but as a measure of authenticity. Would you live this life over and over again, just as you're living it now? Could you bear the idea of repeating every gesture, every decision, every silence? If the answer is no, something must change, not outside, but within. There is no manual for that change. No role model to follow. There is only life, pulsing with its complexity, its brutal beauty, its irreducible mystery. And here we are, trying to learn how to stay awake, to be true to what we feel, to not give up when the darkness threatens to swallow us whole. Because even in the dark, there is truth. Even in chaos, there are seeds. Even in defeat, there is possibility. True life begins when we stop living on autopilot. When we look in the mirror without filters and, instead of running away, we choose to stay. To hold ourselves. To accompany ourselves. When we stop begging for meaning and start creating it. When we understand that there are no saviors, no shortcuts, no guaranteed destinies. Only us, the present moment, and the chance to choose with dignity. That choice is daily. It's fragile. It can be lost at any moment. But it can also be reclaimed. And in that reclaiming, in that reconnection, everything is found. Because it's not about reaching a perfect state, but about returning, again and again, to that place where we are more ourselves than ever. Where we don't act out of fear, or duty, or habit, but out of conviction. Because we know, even if no one validates it, that this is what we must do. Because the soul says so. Because the blood feels it. Because the body confirms it. In the end, to live as Nietzsche suggests is not to seek greatness, but to reject the smallness of a borrowed life. It's not about becoming a hero, it's about no longer being a slave. It's not about reaching a summit, but about walking without lies. It's not about being enlightened, but about being set on fire. And in that fire, to be purified. To shed what's false, what's superficial, what's imposed. And finally, to be left naked, vulnerable, free. We may never know if that life is better than the other one, the comfortable, predictable, accepted life. But we will know, with intimate certainty, that it was ours. And that, in a world where almost everything is a copy, is a miracle. So when the end comes, because it always does, and we look back, maybe we'll smile, not because of what we achieved, but because of how we lived. Not because we were successful, but because we were faithful to ourselves. And then, with peace in our hearts, we'll be able to say, yes, this life, with its light and its shadows, I would live again. Because it was mine. Because I was me. And in that final moment, we'll understand that it doesn't matter how long our life lasted, or how much recognition we received. Only one thing matters, that there was a moment when we woke up, and from that point on, every step, every word, every breath, was a sacred act of affirmation. A deep yes to life just as it is. Because true life, the only one worth living, begins the day we stop being afraid and decide to be. Nothing more. Nothing less. Just that. And that changes everything.